I own academic work. A lot of it is kind of on the borders between philosophy and literature, you might say.
The well-worn inheritance must be carefully undone. Remove the broken cover. Unstring the worn-out threads. Take the precious publication back to the beginnings of a book.
Not just as sort of a philosophical idea that then a poet picks up and writes into verse. I think it's often far more complex than that some of the same ideas, metaphors, images that are arising in literature at a certain time may be arising in philosophy at the same time, and the two can help to illuminate each other.
In step, they produce a pattern like this.
So today I'm going to talk a little bit about a philosophical problem that gripped many people in the late 1700s, right around the period of 1800 I'll be talking about mainly, and some ways in which that works itself out in a couple of literary texts. So, we'll start with, very briefly, Immanuel Kant, who lived from 1724 to 1804. And Kant, among other things, but just to try to put it briefly, said, okay, what I'm doing is sort of like a Copernican revolution in philosophy, in epistemology maybe specifically, and how we understand the world around us. So he said, just as Copernicus suggested, okay, we see the stars are moving and stuff. If we imagine for a moment it's actually the Earth turning around and going around the sun, we can explain the motion of these stars much better than if we think of the Earth standing still and the stars moving around us. Similarly, Kant said, my philosophy, if we think about how do we understand the world around us, the phenomenological world, the world of material objects around us, it makes a lot more sense, rather than thinking that these material objects beyond us tell us what they are. It makes more sense in some way if we think about it as us seeing them a certain way, or telling them what they are, sort of. We can better understand how we see the world. And so he wasn't just saying we invent the world around us necessarily, but he was saying, we have limitations. He called them categories of perceptions. We have certain ways that we're capable of seeing the world. We don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are able to see the world, because we're trapped in time and space, and we have limited sensory perceptions and so on. We can't see the world in and of itself, but only a representation of the world that we're capable of making, so to speak. And this general idea was controversial. In many ways it's controversial to this day, of course, but it caused for some people anxiety. I mean, there was an anxiety of that period around the issue of how do we know that the way we see the world is the way that it really is? Or is it possible that I am sort of solipsistically cut off from everybody around me? Alienated from nature, from other people, potentially from the divine. For example, the German Romantic writer Heinrich Kleist, who lived from 1777 to 1811, committed suicide, but as many poets did. Anyway, Kleist suffered a Kant crisis right around 1801. It's frequently referred to as his Kant crisis anyway. That's not why he committed suicide. That's another story. We won't go into that now. But he was very upset and depressed about it. And he created a metaphor related to his crisis of green glasses. I'll just read you a little quote here, quotation from March of 1801 in a letter he wrote to his fiancée. So after his encounter with Kantian philosophy, Kleist writes, if all people had green glasses instead of eyes, they would be forced to conclude that the objects they view through them are green. And they would never be able to determine if their eye showed them things as they are, or if it didn't add something to the picture, something belonging not to the things themselves, but to the eye. It is the same with our understanding. We can't determine if the thing we call truth is in actuality the truth, or if it only appears so to us. If the latter is the case, then the truth we obtained ceases to exist and when we die, and all efforts to gain something that might follow us beyond the grave are in vain. Well, that's just the way he put it in this letter, but he had this whole crisis around this notion that everything I perceive is just what I perceive. I never am sure if what I see is real in some sense. Okay, now keeping that idea in mind, so that kind of sets up the problem a little. There's a problem between the subject and the object, is the way it's often put in philosophy. The subject, here I am, a subject looking at you, or all these objects around me, and I don't know if what I perceive is not what I'm just projecting onto the world, rather than what the world is telling me. And I may feel, therefore, alienated from the world around me. Now, this is a problem in many ways for Romanticism, for this period, particularly in the issue of the area of nature, the natural world out there. What is it and how does it relate to me? Okay, so now I'm going to jump over to a post-Kantian philosopher, and really, there are several you could talk about in this context, but Friedrich Schelling, I-N-G, who lived contemporary of Kleist, 1775 to 1854. He lived quite a long life, actually. In the 1790s, worked on what he called the philosophy of nature, Philosophie der Natur in German, to impart at the University of Jena and some other places in Germany. And, he, in a sense, is saying with this philosophy of nature to Kleist, don't panic, okay, about the Kantian thing, right? I know it looks bad, but let's just think about it a different way. If we start from, instead of starting from the subject and thinking about how can the subject relate to objects outside of itself, let's start with nature itself. Let's start with the objects and think about what objects are. What sort of thing is nature, and that will help us better understand how we can relate to it. And this is getting us towards these metaphors of nature that poets use of the era too. But anyway, what he ultimately suggests, that is Friedrich Schelling, the philosopher, and his philosophy of nature, is that we need to conceive of nature not as some materialists of the time do, as a vast machine, right, like giant elaborate clockwork or something, which we are just a small part, but rather as with metaphors that are still familiar with us to this day in things like environmentalist movement and Gaia and that sort of thing, as one vast organism. So he essentially says the universe is one unified, one organism, and the universe itself comes into being, or nature comes into being, if you imagine it something like a stream of energy just moving through the universe. The stream of energy tries to articulate or express itself, and it does so through the creation of material objects. So this life force runs through all of nature and animates everything, even immaterial objects like rocks or whatever. But it's also in motion, so as people at that time realized all of the earth is in motion, everything is being transformed from one state to another continuously, but also he imagined that the whole material universe is moving towards a goal of self-articulation, self-expression, which in some sense comes to fruition in human beings who are able to ask philosophical questions, to be self-reflective, to ask questions about the world around us, and that we are therefore not a completely distinct form of being from the rest of nature, but just products of nature itself, a late stage of natural development, if you will. Therefore, he might say to Kleist, again, don't panic, because although it may seem the case that we are cut off from the natural world, that we're not certain if our perceptions are really projections onto the world, at another more fundamental level, we are one with the universe. We are a part of this vast organism, and therefore we are not distinct from it. We only perceive ourselves to be distinct from it, and we can overcome that feeling. Schelling even used the metaphor of the world soul, which he took from Plato and other Neoplatonic ideas. And he says, poetically, you could call it, people have called it the world soul. That is like the force, this animating spirit that runs through all of nature, that's everywhere and therefore nowhere. And he also suggests Schelling, that there are moments in which we have the capacity sort of to step outside of ourselves or to step into ourselves, depending on which metaphor you want to use, and kind of connect with everything around us, to feel that we are no longer just me here and the world is outside there, but I'm an integral part of the world, no longer individual but universal in some way. That's actually an expression that Friedrich Schiller, the poet and philosopher at that time, used similarly. And Schelling called this capacity intellectual intuition. Now that's the way that the term is usually translated into English. And intellectual at this time means something not as we think of it now as just sort of cerebral, but more like non-material, non-physical intuition. So sensory intuition would be with our eyes, ears, and so on. The fact, our senses. This would be like a sixth sense, some sense that's not physical.
Do you seriously believe that when my brain is in that basin, it'll be able to function exactly as it does now?
I don't see why not. It's the same brain. It's alive. It's completely undamaged. In fact, because we won't have disturbed the 3 outer casings, it's completely untouched. The big difference, of course, would be that we would have severed all the nerves leading into it. And that means that your thinking would no longer be influenced by your senses. You'd be living in an extraordinarily pure and detached world.
We have these moments in which the physical body sort of is put on hold and we're able to commune with the spirit that flows through all of nature. So these little examples, I think, point towards the way in which, at this period, certain romantic philosophers and poets are attempting to find a way to come to terms with, to deal with, you might say, a philosophical problem, the problem of the subject cut off from the object. But even if you leave that Kant aside, it's a very human problem, the problem of loss, alienation, separation, that we live in a world in which things that we desire or need or want to have are constantly being taken away from us. But one thing that interests me then is the way in which these figures, metaphors, symbols, images, more time to go into the difference between those things, but the way in which they emerge at this period of time so powerfully, and the way that we might see them, well, what they're trying to do, what is at stake for them, what they're trying to accomplish. And as I've said, what they're trying to accomplish, I think, is to function as a strategy for coming to terms with the very human experience of loss. On the one hand, come to terms with the philosophical problem, the problem of the solipsistic I, if you will, the individual cut off from nature, but also to come to terms with that very human problem of loss through death, the transitory nature of experience. And just the fact that the world continually thwarts our own desires. This image then, this fantasy, this metaphor of an immaterial body, an immaterial form of experience that would overcome that potential loss.